How did humans reach every corner of Earth? Most people picture a ship or a wheel. Fair guess. Big journeys need big machines. Except neither existed when your ancestors crossed nearly the whole map. Picture a frozen plain. Wind biting your skin. No trail ahead. Just footprints you made. Somehow those legs alone outlasted animals built to outrun them in seconds. So what carried humans that far, without a wheel or a ship? The answer starts somewhere. Nobody expects. David Carrier did not start with hunting. He started with heat. Carrier, a biologist who did much of this work at the University of Utah, noticed something in the 1980s that most people walk right past without a second thought. Humans regulate heat through sweat spread across nearly the entire body. Close to 2 million sweat glands by most estimates, while most fast animals, including horses and deer, rely mainly on panting, which barely works once they are sprinting at full effort. A deer can leave you behind in the first 10 seconds of a flat-out sprint. No contest. But a deer also has to stop. It has to slow down, drop its head. Bon, cool off, before it can run again. Carrier's research suggested this single difference in cooling was not a minor detail. It may have been the advantage that let a slow, upright ape outlast animals it could never outrun in a straight race. Decades later, Daniel Lieberman and his colleague Dennis Bramble, both working out of Harvard University, took the idea further. In a study published in the journal Nature, they compared skeletal features across humans and other primates and counted more than 24 distinct traits. Long legs, a springy arch in the foot, a tendon at the back of the ankle that stores and releases energy with every stride, a specific ligament running down the back of the neck that seems to exist mainly to stabilize the head during rhythmic N. Repeated impact, none of it points toward speed. All of it points toward one purpose. Not sprinting. Distance. Skeletal evidence from early Homo specimens. Cross-checked by researchers at institutions including the Smithsonian, backs this up in a quieter way. The proportions show up again and again. Long legs relative to torso length. Hip and shoulder joints built to counter-rotate with each stride. In fossils that predate any tool sophisticated enough to kill from a distance, before the spear got good, the body had already placed its bet on something else entirely. Older tracks agree with the bones. In Kenya, a trail of footprints, estimated at roughly 1.5 million years old, studied by a team that included Brian Richmond of George Washington University, shows a walking pattern nearly identical to a modern human stride, long before the rest of the anatomy had finished catching up to it. The gait came first. Everything else followed. This tends to break the mental image most people are working with. The default picture is a caveman with a club, all brute force. Short bursts of violence, over almost as soon as it starts. That picture is not really wrong so much as it is incomplete in a way that flips the emphasis entirely backward. The body that evolution actually seems to have favored was not the one that wins in the first 10 seconds. It was the one still moving after everything else had already stopped. Picture the reconstructed version of what that body might have been used for. Midday. The sun directly overhead. Heat, rising visibly off open ground. An animal breaks into a full sprint. The moment it senses a person approaching, it vanishes over a ridge in seconds. Gone. A hunter does not sprint after it. That would be pointless. And everyone involved seems to already understand that. He simply keeps walking. Steady, almost boring to watch. Following tracks pressed into the dirt. Sometimes losing them for a stretch, and picking them up again 50 yards later. The animal reappears an hour later, already breathing hard, already a little slower than before. It runs again, shorter this time. It slows again, sooner this time. Dust hangs in the air where it stood. The heat does not let up, not for a second. And that is exactly the point, because the same heat that exhausts the animal barely registers on the person who keeps walking through it at the same unhurried pace as before. Somewhere in the third or fourth hour, its body can no longer shed heat fast enough to keep moving, while the person trailing it has barely broken a sweat that started an hour ago and never really built. There is no final sprint, no dramatic finish. The hunt ends not with a chase, but with waiting. This strategy, sometimes called persistence hunting, has been documented in modern accounts of desert hunting communities and is referenced in U.S. anthropological literature as evidence for endurance-based survival rather than speed-based survival. Not everyone agrees it was the whole picture, though. Robert Blumenschein, a paleoanthropologist whose research has been affiliated with Rutgers University, has argued for decades that early humans likely relied just as much on confrontational scavenging, moving in on carcasses other predators had already brought down, using group numbers and noise rather than a chase at all. Maybe both are true, in different places, at different times. With different groups, maybe the honest answer is less tidy than either story on its own. Either way, the pattern underneath stays the same. Not the fastest body in the room, the one that could keep showing up hour after hour, long after everything faster had already quit. Picture that version too. Briefly, a group approaches a carcass. Another predator has already left behind, moving together, making noise, holding their ground as a unit rather than as individuals. No single body in that group is fast enough or strong enough to take on a larger predator alone. Together, moving with coordination and patience rather than panic. They do not need to be. Endurance shows up here too, just wearing a different outfit. Less about the chase and more about who is willing to simply stay put the longest. Whether the body was chasing or waiting, the underlying trait being rewarded generation after generation looks remarkably consistent. Next time a long walk in the heat leaves you sweating steadily instead of gasping for air, notice it. That is the same cooling system, still doing its original job, on a much smaller errand. Here is the part that rarely makes it into the neat version of this story. Several researchers who have revisited the endurance running hypothesis in recent years have pointed out that clearly documented cases of persistence hunting are actually rare, not common. And some argue it may have been used only occasionally rather than as a routine strategy. That does not undo the theory. It complicates it, which is arguably more interesting, and it is worth noticing that the story getting messier is usually a sign the science is working as intended rather than falling apart. The advantage those bodies carried may have mattered less for chasing down a meal and more for something almost nobody frames as impressive walking. Long, unremarkable, everyday walking, across distances that would exhaust nearly any other primate on the planet, day after day, without any single moment that looked dramatic at all. That distinction matters, because most human migration was never one dramatic chase across a continent. It was thousands of ordinary days that simply refused to stop adding up. Somewhere during the last glacial period, tens of thousands of years ago. Imagine standing at the edge of a treeless plain, the air sharp enough to sting the inside of your nose. No trail ahead, no landmark, only frozen grass stretching toward a horizon that looks exactly the same no matter which way you turn. Somewhere behind you is everything familiar, every fire that has ever kept you warm, every voice you already know by heart. Ahead is nothing you recognize. Children are carried on hips or shoulders when their legs give out. Someone older walks a little slower at the back, and the group's pace bends around that without anyone announcing it. Nobody is chasing glory. Nobody even has a word yet for the idea of a continent. There was no plan to cross a continent. There was only the next herd, the next water source, the next patch of shelter from the wind, The group moved forward the same way it moved every other day, one step at a time. And somehow that repeated so many times in so many bodies across so many generations on nearly every landmass on Earth that it added up to continents nobody had set out to conquer. Nobody set out to make history. History simply accumulated one horizon at a time by people who mostly just wanted to eat that night. Some of those actual footprints survived, which is almost strange to say out loud, at a site called White Sands in New Mexico. Researchers, including Kathleen Springer and Jeffrey Pigotty of the United States Geological Survey, helped date a trail of ancient human tracks preserved in what was once soft lakeshore mud. The dating suggested people were walking across that ground during the peak of the last ice age, at a time when many textbooks still confidently claimed humans had not reached North America yet. Some of the tracks even show a shorter, smaller set of footprints stepping in and out of the longer adult stride. A child, tagging along, or being kept close, on a walk that turned out to matter more than anyone at the time could possibly have known. Who? Somewhere out there. A single afternoon of somebody just walking to find food ended up rewriting an entire continent's timeline. Thousands of years later, by accident. Walking explains the land. It does not explain the ocean, and that is where the story gets stranger. Long before compasses existed with any real accuracy, some human groups crossed enormous stretches of open water using nothing but attention. Research connected to the University of Hawaii's studies of traditional Pacific navigation, including work tied to the modern Polynesian Voyaging Society, describes a system built almost entirely from pattern recognition rather than instruments. Voyagers read the direction and rhythm of ocean swells the way a driver today reads a road sign, telling one pattern from another mostly by feel, sometimes lying down inside the hull, just to sense the rhythm of the water through the wood. They tracked where certain stars rose and set across the sky, using the night itself as a slow, rotating compass that never needed batteries. They even studied the underside of clouds. Since certain cloud shapes can reflect the color of a lagoon from many miles away, long before any island becomes visible to the eye. Thomas Gladwin, an American anthropologist who documented these methods decades ago, described the underlying system using a word borrowed from the navigators themselves. Etak is a way of tracking position, not by watching where the canoe was headed, but by imagining a reference island sliding backward beneath the stars while the canoe itself stayed still in the mind of the person steering it. It sounds backward, almost impossible, until you realize it worked. Repeatedly, across thousands of miles of open water, guiding voyagers to islands too small to see from more than a few miles away. Picture the specific moment this actually mattered. A navigator lying flat in the hull of a canoe, eyes closed, feeling for a change in the rhythm of the swell against the wood. Nothing visible has changed. No island, no bird, no smell of land yet. But the rhythm shifts just slightly, and the navigator calls for a small correction in course, hours before anyone else on board would have noticed anything different at all. That correction, repeated across a voyage lasting weeks, is the difference between finding an island the size of a small town in the middle of an ocean and missing it entirely. Stack all of that together, and it starts to look less like luck and more like an entire unwritten science, carried from person to person for generations, refined by trial and error, without a single page of paper involved anywhere in the process. You already do a rough version of this without noticing. Check how often you glance at the sky before deciding whether to grab a jacket, or how you can tell rain is coming from the particular way the air suddenly smells different. That instinct for reading small environmental cues did not appear yesterday. And it is quieter than it looks. So if legs could cross continents and attention could cross oceans, where does that leave the invention most people assume made global travel possible in the first place? Hmm. Here's the part that surprises almost everyone the first time they hear it. David Anthony, a historian at Hartwick College who has spent much of his career studying the archaeological record of early wheeled vehicles, has pointed out that wheels show up surprisingly late compared to how long humans had already been on the move. Anthony's research on the archaeological record from the Eurasian steppe suggests the earliest wheeled vehicles were not built for exploring the unknown at all. They were built for hauling grain and goods across ground people already knew intimately, over short and familiar distances, not toward some distant horizon. Even once they existed, early wheeled carts were heavy. They hard to steer over rough or unpaved ground, and mostly useful for short local trips between settlements rather than sweeping migrations across unfamiliar terrain. By the time the wheel became genuinely useful for long-distance travel, humans had already reached nearly every habitable landmass on Earth, crossed land bridges exposed by lower sea levels, and sailed across open ocean guided by nothing but memory and observation passed down without writing. The wheel did not open the world. The world was already open. The wheel just made getting around inside it more convenient. Once people had already gone ahead and settled it on foot, and by boat, none of this stayed safely in the past. By the way, most days now involve a car, an elevator, a chair, and very little walking at all compared to the distances those same bodies were shaped to cover. The hardware did not get the memo that the errands got shorter. A short flight of stairs instead of the elevator, a slow walk around the block after dinner instead of the couch. None of that feels like an ancient survival strategy in the moment. Structurally, though, it is exactly that. The same equipment handed a small and deliberate reason to keep doing the job it was originally built for. Stephanie Studensky, a researcher at the University of Pittsburgh, tracked survival data on more than 30,000 older adults across several studies pooled together. What she found was almost too simple at first glance. How fast someone walked predicted how long they were likely to live, sometimes more reliably than other measurements already sitting in their medical chart. Not how much they could lift, not how far they could sprint, just an ordinary, unhurried walking pace, measured in a hallway with a stopwatch, nothing dramatic about the test itself at all. The same gait your ancestors used to cross an entire continent, still quietly reporting on how the whole machine is holding up. Decades later, the same machine built for crossing frozen plains and reading ocean swells is apparently still keeping score quietly in a hospital hallway instead of on a glacier. So the next short walk you almost skip in favor of driving 3 minutes down the road, that small decision is quietly talking to the same hardware your ancestors used to cross deserts and outlast animals twice as fast as they were. It's late in Houston right now. Are you still awake? There is something almost tender about realizing the same legs carrying you to the fridge tonight once carried someone across an entire ice age. One unremarkable step at a time. The curiosity pulling you toward a place you have never been did not start with you, and it will not end with you either. As Neil Armstrong put it, standing somewhere no human had ever stood before. That's one small step for man. One giant leap for mankind. So the next time you picture how humans reached every corner of the earth, don't picture a ship or a wheel. Picture a single set of footprints, disappearing over a horizon nobody had crossed before, and somehow kept going anyway.